I'm kind of glad I did it, but I'm also very glad that I moved on to Hendy. That kind of undefined project work that in some ways is where I choose to spend my time is where the vast majority of it goes.
Hi, Jonathan. Also, thank you first of all for agreeing to take part in this. What we'll do first of all is just tell us a bit more about yourself, your current role, and what you do at the moment at Hendy.
As you're aware, I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Hendy. The business is quite a sizable business these days, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how it's come to be so. We should have in a normal year now an annualised turnover of over £1 billion and something around 1,600 to 1,700 employees across about 45 sites. I mean, I suppose my job as CFO has a number of different strings to it. And I think it may be a statement of the obvious to say that as the role grows in a growing organisation, the nature of what you do changes quite radically. And whereas I came into Hendy probably 6 years ago looking quite closely at, let's say, individual dealership performance, the role has become far more strategic in outlook. And you'd probably say the first key responsibility is being part of the main board governing the strategic direction of the business. Clearly, within that, then I have my specific finance responsibilities. And ultimately, I guess that boils down to ensuring, most critically, that we have the funding to be able to implement the strategic plans of the business. Apart from that, there are clearly a lot of other strings to the finance bow. Clearly, it's vital that I also have to ensure that we've got a finance function that is fulfilling its basic requirements, all the prosaic stuff in terms of ensuring suppliers are paid on time, we're collecting our debts, but probably more importantly, that we are managing our cash effectively and providing insight to the business in terms of the management information we're providing. So all of that's critical. The other area that's not to be forgotten in terms of the CFO role, the not so glamorous, I suppose, area of compliance and internal control is making sure that the key risks of the business are properly and robustly managed. And that could be anything from ensuring our insurance program is appropriate to ensuring that we have a proper framework for adhering to all the regulatory compliance that we have. And that's an increasing area, as I'm sure most people in finance or in business will be aware that despite the apparent intentions of the current government and how Brexit might free us from red tape, that the regulatory environment actually seems to get increasingly difficult and demanding. So there are a whole variety of different things. I mean, just picking up on what does that mean in terms of how I spend my time, I'd probably say there aren't very many what I'd describe as typical days. There are a few things which I will do every month at a certain time, and probably key amongst those are ensuring that I deliver proper updates to not only our bank, but also other sort of funding partners as a vehicle dealership business. We also have lots of manufacturers who have enormous credit lines into us, and we have our used vehicles funded by third parties. And maintaining the relationship with those parties and ensuring their ongoing confidence in us that we're an appropriate credit risk is an absolutely key part of the role. In terms of the bank itself, with a business like Hendy, where we've got significant debt, it's not just an equity funded business, it's also vital that I, in conjunction with my treasury team, are looking at the bank covenants against which our senior debt facility is set. So it's vital that we're looking ahead at all of those, not only believing, hopefully, that we are going to adhere to those covenants, but looking properly and understanding that if there are any issues, we need to flag those up as early as possible and have some meaningful conversations about them. So I'd say managing the relationships with funders, it does take a significant amount of my time. That's probably the most regular thing I do, other than attending meetings monthly. And meetings will obviously, I guess the key meetings are presence at our operational board meeting, which is effectively looking at the trading performance of the business, and then quarterly we have a Topco statutory board meeting that's more strategic in focus. So those are probably the regular things. Apart from that, I dabble in the month-end process, but I don't have to do a lot. And it's my team, Kyle Wood, the group financial controller, who effectively runs the day-to-day of the finance team. So I don't have to get too engaged in that. But obviously, I'm talking to Kyle and some of his managers reasonably regularly about any key issues within the department, and also liaising with him about where the result is actually going to land and also where the current month forecast is likely to land. So there are some elements that are regular, and then probably the far greater element is not so regular project work, anything we need to do from a strategic perspective, anything we're working on to place longer term plans, and looking at what we can do to add value to the business. Bearing in mind, as a sector, it's a very low margin sector, and it's vital that we are always looking at ways of keeping our cost base pretty trim and looking at how we can enhance profitability. And one of the kind of mantras within the business is marginal gains, and trying to build marginal gains to get a stronger profit margin. So, but that kind of undefined project work that in some ways is where I choose to spend my time, is where the vast majority of it goes.
Yeah, and I guess that is the time when you're adding value to the business, like you said, like looking at that kind of margin improvement that's going to ultimately have that effect on the turnover and the profitability of the company, which is it's key, isn't it? What made you want to work for Hendy?
I liked Paul Hendy as a CEO and the chairman, Simon Gulliford, when they interviewed me. That was an attractor. I was aware at the time that there were development plans that sounded very interesting. It was probably there were some areas that I would have been kind of more uneasy about had Paul and Simon not been very compelling at the interview process, because it would have been possible. I came from a relatively substantial corporate background, and the idea probably wouldn't have been that exciting for me of spending a lot of years in a business that was just going to tread water, and in a privately owned organisation just treading water for years. But clearly there was an intended development path set out, so that was a key attractor. I've always liked the automotive sector anyway. I spent 9 years earlier in my career with Inchcape. So I was already quite well versed in the sector. Always found it quite compelling, with a whole variety of extremely interesting characters. So the kind of story and the sense of what was intended and the apparent culture of the business were, I suppose, the key things that attracted me into it.
I guess it's buying into that sort of whole vision of the longer term plans and objectives of the organisation. Taking it back then, so why finance, Jonathan? Did you kind of have that from an early age? I want to get into finance. Or was it just kind of you fell into it? How did that kind of come about?
I suspect that there are not that many of us who kind of at a relatively early age think I really want to be an accountant. and I certainly wasn't one of those. What I would say is that I did quite like economics, and I've always been quite strong at maths, and I ended up doing a degree in economics and accounting. But even at that point, I wasn't particularly set on any career path. And I have to say, I think it's fair to say, therefore, I fell into it. It was kind of, economics I was really interested in. Accountancy obviously added a kind of more vocational element to it, but it was the economics that was drawing me in at that point. At the end, as we were coming to the last year of university, I was thinking, I've got to find myself a job here, and put bluntly, the obvious route with a degree in economics and accountancy was to go and work for an accountancy firm. And I wasn't set on the career when I started out, and I've got to be quite honest about it. I would also say I went to work for one of the big four in London, and I didn't enjoy it very much. Did not enjoy the kind of training years where you're doing external audit. I have thoroughly enjoyed my career in later times, and I suppose I look back on that period as one of kind of investment in a basic set of knowledge that actually stood me in good stead. But I would have been quite dubious at that time as to whether that was going to be my longer term career or whether I might change direction. So I think it'd be false to say I really set out with a particular career path in mind or a special interest in finance. I found economics interesting and I was good at maths. So I guess there is a kind of natural fit. It wasn't some sort of long-term scheme, I have to say.
Yeah. Economics and finance, accounting do go kind of hand in hand, really, don't they? And I presume when you were in practice working for the Big Four, did you go through your qualification then, did you?
Yes, I did. I qualified as a chartered accountant during that period.
Do you think when it comes to qualification, do you think there's a lot of questions always around in terms of how long did it take that person to qualify? Do you, in your opinion, do you think speed matters when you're qualifying, or in terms of how long it took you to get to that end goal?
I don't think it matters that much. I have to say that through my career, I was often faced with the question, did you pass your exams first time? It's helpful if you can honestly answer yes, but I don't think that question goes that far, and I don't think it is that likely to mean you're not going to be given a job which you otherwise suit. So I don't think it is that important. I think it's more a question of what you have been able to deliver in the roles that you have done and how you're able to present that and present yourself when you have new opportunities. I think those are more important elements. I do think a qualification is important. You do get occasionally reasonably senior finance people with qualification by experience, and they're often very, very good because they've had to be very good to get into that position without the qualification behind them. The qualifications definitely open more doors for you. And I'd probably say within that, I think the chartered accounting qualification opens more doors than the other qualifications, which are, really good qualifications as well. And it's not going to stop you if you do, let's say, CIMA rather than chartered. It's not going to necessarily stop you, but you might find a position where roles are specifically only open to those with chartered accounting qualification, or even in the shortlisting process, the one opens more doors than the other.
Why do you reckon that is?
I don't actually know. I wonder whether it's a historic thing where perhaps the role of a senior finance individual is very much in terms of technical accounting and compliance. And I guess probably the chartered accounting qualification starts off as something pretty technical, whereas let's say CIMA is more about how the business performs and how you can provide insight into business performance and help generate business performance. And that's kind of probably an area that's developed more in recent years, and maybe that's why, maybe it's just the perception hasn't caught up. I don't know.
In terms of advice, what would you give someone who's looking to start a career in finance?
I first say be open-minded and try and open yourself up to as many different strands of finance and accounting as you can, because you might find you like certain things a lot and you like others. From a personal perspective, I always did find actually the management, accounting and insight areas and working with commercial teams to try and generate business or make it more profitable to be much the more exciting part of the role. But that's not the case for everyone. Yeah. And I think opening yourself up to as many different experiences and just trying to be open about just about the experience you have, I think is key to find the right career route for you, because there are many, many different career routes available. Some, for myself and probably for those who are wanting to be finance directors or CFOs or whatever, it kind of feels like more of a generalist role. I don't feel like I'm a particular expert in anything much. You can have a really good career with a really specialist route. You can be part of an advisory firm specializing in capital allowances, for example. For me, that wouldn't work because I think perhaps I've just not got the right level of concentration. But I look at more things than that, and I couldn't spend all my time on a relatively narrow area. But there are some people, I think, for whom that level of expertise and the ability to communicate that is an extremely attractive. I also think, having said that, I kind of wandered through the early part of my career without any particular intention. I do actually think as you start going through your career, it's also important to think about the roles that you are going to do and try and ensure that you are getting that kind of breadth of experience, and perhaps also think about the employers that you might work for. You will get a good breadth of experience probably if you work in the accounting profession for a number of different clients, but if you're working in commerce, then you're more likely, well, there are different things you're going to get from different scales of employers. You're going to get a far bigger breadth of experience in a smaller business. In other ways, it might be much more limiting for you. And again, you just need to think through the various pros and cons of that.
Well, I think like you said at the beginning there, it's just about trying, isn't it? Because like you said, some people will just like focusing on that particular area, and you might find that quite early on in your career that, I'm really interested in this kind of space and this is the route I kind of want to go down. Or you might find yourself, I need that variety. After you left practice then, whereabouts did you go?
I went at that point to work for Inchcape. I actually left to go and spend an academic year in France and learn to speak French fluently. And there was kind of half a plan in there that I liked travelling as well. And I thought I might get a job with a language and an accounting qualification. I might get a job that gave me some travel experience. And I came back and looked for internal audit roles in industry, and Inchcape was the one that most appealed to me. And I went into that business. So that, at the time, I think was still a FTSE 100 PLC, and I went into its automotive internal audit department, which had a worldwide remit. So I got a huge amount of experience, and I have to say it was the first time I started actually really enjoying my job. It's got a pretty bad name, internal audit. I appreciate that. You're probably the least welcome visitor that there can be at any particular business, but I actually found it really interesting because I started to understand how these particular businesses in Inchcape worked, and I felt I was at last able to start bringing some genuine value because I could see what was good in one place and suggest it at another. And I know there's a kind of sense that the managing director at the business isn't going to listen too much to a fairly young internal auditor, but actually you do start to get through, and they do start to appreciate when you start to learn about the business more broadly, and people will start to realise that, and you can start to add value. I also found it a very character building role in that you are also, certainly in the way it worked at Inchcape, I was often dealing directly with some quite senior people in the organisation and some quite senior people in relatively delicate circumstances, and circumstances in which I quite often had to stand my ground against some quite vociferous arguments. So that I found very useful from a personal point of view, and just building that ability to, I suppose, communicate with senior people and not be beaten into submission by them, as it were.
I could imagine. You mentioned internal auditors are always seen as the bad ones. All audits coming in, be ship-shape, and let's put them in the room and let's give them all the boxes and let's leave them to it and not answer as many questions. So I can see how that would build your character. And would you say it's quite a good first move from someone going from practice into industry?
I mean, I would say so, yes. I would say that if you're going through that route, you should try and get some sort of confidence through your recruitment process that there is a route for internal auditors then into the financial management roles within the business. That clearly was the case with Inchcape. They were able to tell me about previous auditors who then moved into other roles, and sure enough, that's the case. Because again, there are a few people who want to be career internal auditors, but generally the stepping stone and part of your route, unless you really want that career audit, is to be convinced that there is going to be a step on. And if there is, it can be a great step on because you start to know the business quite well before you're put into a line management role. So from there, I did that. I mean, I spent 9 years with Inchcape in all, and about the first 2 or so were in internal audit, and then I started to move into management roles, the first being a kind of head office divisional financial controller role, which was completely different in flavour because it was all about consolidating both, I suppose it was management and statutory accounting consolidation work with probably 100 businesses in from worldwide in multi-currency. So I'd gone from something where I was able to focus on particular processes in a particular business to something quite different, which was actually technically really demanding, and was my first experience of managing people to any extent as well. So Inchcape really helped in giving me that opportunity.
I guess you get to kind of learn it from the ground up, but you do an internal audit, you go around to these different places, then you're moving into that financial controller role, and you're kind of really underneath the skin of the business then, aren't you? And how long were you in the controller role for?
I'm just thinking, I think it was about another 2 years, 2.5 years that I was in that role. And it was, the first year of that was one of the toughest years of my career, just because the learning curve was so steep. I remember sometimes it was kind of enjoyable because it was a good environment, but some of the hours I had to work at that time and the pressure of being in a PLC environment where there was no room for lateness, no room for getting your submissions wrong, and you were also reliant on, to say, almost 100 businesses around the world to report into you first before you could do your bit. So you're trying to persuade and coach people around the world, and then you have a complex process to carry out with a team when you're new to managing the team and new to some of the technical demands. It's a real learning experience. But I think probably, again, all of these things build a certain amount of resilience, which I think you probably is extremely helpful, certainly in business.
Where did you move to after Inchcape? Earlier you mentioned it was more of a kind of corporate organisation by the sounds of it.
Inchcape then moved me on to, I had 3 different finance director roles at Inchcape. So it's the first time I became a finance director was maybe 6 years into my Inchcape career.
Yeah.
So Inchcape then had subsidiaries around the world, and they put me in to be finance director of various generally troubled subsidiaries. And the first 2 that I went to, we sold one of them and then closed down the next. So by the time I reached the third one, I probably wasn't probably bad news, but the third one was actually what brought me to the region, which was Inchcape Fleet Solutions, based in Port Solent, was my final role with Inchcape. And after that, I moved on into the aerospace industry. I mean, I think they were interested in some of the sort of working capital and supply chain experience that I'd had with Inchcape in the kind of distribution part of the business. That was what appealed. The aerospace business that I was working for was effectively managing supply chains and selling parts. It wasn't manufacturing as such. And that business, it was part of a subsidiary of a smaller PLC. The role there as finance director, again, of a particular subsidiary, was quite heavily focused on the commercial performance of the business and the management of the working capital. But that grew and grew and grew, and my remit became pretty much global eventually. Oh, wow. In that organisation. I was there for 9 years, and I also experienced a change. We changed from PLC ownership to private equity ownership after about 7 years. So I kind of also was quite heavily involved in that, which also, again, gave me another perspective, what the different culture that comes with a different ownership structure.
And I've heard that private equity is very different, and also PLCs is very different in terms of reporting timelines. You can't be late, but also private equity is a completely different beast altogether. In terms of then, I presume it was moving on to Hendy.
Yes, I mean, I had another role in between in London, and actually it's probably worth dwelling on, albeit it was not necessarily the hardest year of my career, but one of the most miserable years of my career. But I went to be finance director of a small listed PLC in London, back in the automotive space. And part of it, I think this is probably relevant, people who might listen to this interview, because I'd been told quite often that it might be quite difficult for me to be FD of a standalone business because all of my FD roles had been in subsidiaries, and so I didn't own, let's say, the banking relationship or whatever. And this was a smaller business, back to a 30-40 million turnover business. But it was FD of a standalone PLC in which I had to own all the stakeholder relationships. So part of it was kind of a conscious decision that, although I wasn't entirely sure either that I wanted to commute to London or whether the business was exactly right, I went for it, and actually it did give me some really key experience in terms of managing all the external stakeholder relations. So I'm kind of glad I did it, but I'm also very glad that I moved on to Hendy.
And I presume, the travel in and out of London as well. How long did you do it for?
It was about a year and a quarter.
Fair enough. I presume like lots of early mornings, late nights.
Yes, and I was kind of, my standard weekend was I'd come down, sit on the sofa and fall asleep. So
obviously the automotive sector kind of drew you back in as well, working in London. Then obviously Hendy kind of popped up. What was your first role in Hendy? Was it a finance director role?
Yes, it was. It was part of a succession plan. There was a finance director there who was kind of moving to semi-retirement and became the company secretary.
Yeah.
So they were looking for an FD to come in, but one who I think they felt was capable of helping drive the kind of extension of the business and the development of the business. Yeah. When I came in, the business was turning over I think it was just over 300 million a year. And as I say, now in an COVID uninterrupted year, we should be not far off 1.1 billion. So the growth has been enormous. And as I say, there was the initial aim was to reach 500 million turnover.
Yeah.
Then the next aim was 1 billion turnover, etc. And it's gone on like that, with setting out certain aims and ensuring that we reach those aims profitably.
Hendy have been through, as you mentioned, a massive sort of change. And what's been the key aspects in terms of that growth? Is it more the sort of mergers and acquisition side, or is it something else that's kind of been driving that?
No, it's a slightly strange business model in that the market is pretty much set. The UK vehicle market is the UK vehicle market, so you can make some inroads into winning a little bit of business from other geographies, but generally its acquisition is going to be the main source of growth, and that's the way it's happened with Hendy. And I think, there have been some real challenges on route, and it's been a fantastic journey, but I think it starts out with a clear vision of where we wanted to get to. And absolute tenacity, and I have to give absolute credit to again Paul Hendy and Simon Gulliford, the chairman, in terms of the clarity of vision and the total tenacity with which they were pursuing it. So despite the fact that Hendy had been through some slightly difficult times not long before I'd been there, in terms of being a difficult period for the market, and the business hadn't been very profitable, we were fairly quickly into a process of looking at a potential large strategic acquisition without the benefit of, let's say, public sector or public funding that you can get. If you're in a PLC, you can issue more shares to the general public or to institutions and raise funds. So that was obviously a lot more testing for us as a business, and one of my key roles was helping to persuade potential funders that they should lend us the money for this first major acquisition.
And that first acquisition, I presume, just getting that first one is key, isn't it? And then proving that concept, and then obviously I presume that opens up lines for other funding once you've proven the concept.
You're absolutely right in that acquisition was extremely successful. It was very well implemented as well and integrated within Hendy, and we pretty quickly saw big benefits and some substantial profitability. So we did pretty quickly start delivering on the business plan that we put out to the funders prior to the acquisition, and that ability to deliver was I think really potent and important in the subsequent development of the business.
What would you say that your greatest achievement in your career so far is?
I do actually think this period with Hendy has been the biggest success, because I guess like many corporates across the UK, the business came with a legacy of a defined benefit pension scheme with a pretty nasty deficit. So it had that hanging over it, which was quite a considerable problem with a business turning over 300 million. But I think the fact that we've successfully grown the business has, I think Paul Hendy has sometimes described it as feeling as if he was managing a business for the benefit of the pension scheme originally. Now the pension scheme is just it's a minor irritation in the balance sheet, but its importance in terms of the scale of the business is much diminished. And I genuinely feel that we have developed a really good business with a really positive culture at Hendy. And so I feel, I don't feel the growth has been done at the expense of the heart of the business. And I appreciate within that, there's a historic culture there where I think everyone really appreciated in the dealerships that they might quite regularly get a visit from the statutory directors. And that's probably not quite so possible now. But I do genuinely feel that we've still got a very good spirit and culture at about the business. I'd probably say for sure it will be my proudest achievement to be part of the team that's done that once we see the profitability we're expecting post-pandemic, because since the last major acquisition we've been going through some tougher times, albeit again I think we've ridden the storm really well, but when we see that expected profitability back, that's when I definitely be confident about this being sort of the proudest.
I think so that's a really good achievement in terms of not only from like a growth point of view of the business, but also from a cultural point of view, because sometimes with growth getting to £1 billion turnover, you lose that kind of family feel and that culture, and it turns a lot more corporate, if you like. So I think that's a really good achievement in itself. What's the next kind of professional goal for yourself or for the business? Where's Hendy kind of going? Are we going for £2 billion turnover?
Well, possibly. Certainly. I mean, I would say that strategically we want to continue to develop the scale of the business, albeit we have set ourselves some fairly clear parameters in terms of what that growth looks like. It's not growth at any cost or anywhere, but we certainly wish to continue to grow the business and ensure that the organisation becomes one of the big players in the automotive industry, certainly amongst privately owned motor dealership groups. And that is where we want to go with it. And I have to say, from my perspective, continuing that journey and improving the things that still aren't quite right is probably where I want to go. You know, I feel I really do like this business, and I think again for anyone developing their career, it's a statement of the obvious, but if you really like the job and organisation and the culture of it, of where you're working, that's really good reason to try and stay, and if you can, try and develop your career within that organisation. What
we like to finish on, 3 questions about yourself, but also we kind of glanced over this point actually. Do you still speak fluent French?
I don't know if you can test me out on that one. I do speak. I mean, I did speak fluent French. I'd probably be a bit rusty, but I'm still all right on it.
Yeah, I used to go on any holidays to France at all and get the lingo out?
Occasionally, yes, but probably more limited to ordering a beer and pizza probably rather than anything else at that point.
What do you reckon you would have done if you didn't end up in finance?
It's quite a difficult one. I mean, from a personality perspective, I mean, I'm not sure whether I would have gone into another business role. As a relatively introverted personality, I think I might have looked elsewhere. It's possible I would have gone into something more technical and mathematical. I don't know, something statistical or economic. I don't know, but possibly something completely different, because I always quite like the arts, and I don't know whether I'd have found something to do within the arts. But I always liked writing, and I was really interested in movies and art and stuff, and that. So I don't know, but I don't know whether I'd have found a niche. I didn't find there wasn't anything obvious that I could really turn my hand to well in that area, but it was an area of enthusiasm. So maybe I'd have ended up as a runner delivering coffee for different actors. And
the final question I'll ask you is, if you could invite any 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and why?
I haven't thought through this at all, so I'm just going to come out with them. The first, I would have to say, and no one's ever going to have heard of this person, so probably, so I apologise, but my boyhood hero was a footballer for Crystal Palace called Vince Hilaire, and Vince, he was my big hero. I'd love to ask him. I'd love to have him around and talk to him about what it was like playing for Crystal Palace back in the late 70s and early 80s. So a funny one there. I would probably then back to acting, and the next kind of improbable thing is I did have a bit of a thing for silly horror movies, and I think actually there's a director called Sam Raimi who made various silly horror movies back in the 1980s and a little bit in the 90s. I think I'd really like to have him around and talk to him about horror movies.
And then pretty obscure ones so far. Go on, who's the third one?
I'm sorry, yes.
No, this is good. This is good. I'm going to be Googling these people after.
Third one, goodness knows, a figure of greater historic resonance, wouldn't I? I'll choose a better known one here, Charles Dickens, because I did really, one of the things, apart from my maths, it was English literature that I really liked, but I really did like Charles Dickens' books. Kind of got some sort of fascination with the Victorian era, kind of also get a perspective from him on how the world's changed since his day.
Jenny, Jonathan, thank you very much for your time.